There are some negatives that we have to identify and see how we can deal with. Let me just itemise some of them. First of all, British households are heavily indebted, extraordinarily highly indebted. One of the consequences of the boom cycle that we've been through, some of us warned about the dangers 5-6 years ago, but it was allowed to get out of control. House prices got to unprecedented levels, highly leveraged with heavy household borrowing. British debt, household debt, I'm talking about households here rather than government and business, got to a level in relation to income that's the highest in the developed world because of what happened in the boom period. And so households are thinking very carefully about spending, and rightly and understandably. And what we're beginning to see is a shift away from spending to saving, which is healthy in one respect, but it does mean you're not going to get another consumer boom for the foreseeable future. So that's, if you're thinking about growth, that is a problem. In addition to that, the economy has been kept alive through what I would call monetary steroids, quantitative easing. Nobody's quite sure how this works, to be frank. Government buying up vast amounts of gilts, pumping money into the banking sector, the financial sector generally, and hoping somehow it sort of leaks out into a stimulus. And it sort of worked, but in a very odd kind of way. It seems mainly to have worked by pumping up asset prices, property and share prices, which are a bit unreal. And none of us are quite sure what will happen when that stimulus is taken away, as we've been told it will be taken away in the next few months. The patient may just happily keep going, but it may get serious withdrawal symptoms, but none of us are quite sure. And then we have the banking sector, which was rescued, great cost to the taxpayer, and it's kept functioning. And you've got banks like RBS, which was the biggest bank in the world. Let's not forget that in balance sheet terms. And Lloyds, HBOS, another very big bank, supported by, now owned by you. And what's happened in the banking sector is that the banks have lurched from extreme irresponsibility in some cases. Not all banks were responsible, but HSBC, Standard Chartered, Co-op, they were pretty sound, but some of them were mad and collapsed, and including the ones that are now owned by you. Now what's happened is that those banks have lurched from extreme recklessness to extreme conservatism. They're piling up capital, trying to protect their balance sheets, drastically cutting back on their lending. And anybody who is in small, medium-sized business who is trying to get their working capital renewed or let alone extended is running up against serious problems. And the FSB and the Institute of Directors and the Chambers of Commerce are warning about this week after week. The Governor of the Bank of England warns about this, that the banks, because they're being allowed simply to follow their own short-term concerns, are throttling the recovery of British business. And I think that is a very serious problem. So you have a series of problems there. We then have the government budget deficit, which is extraordinary. And it's worth reflecting a little bit on what's happened here. Essentially, we've got into a position where the government's borrowing 12, 13, nobody's quite sure how much, 12, 13, 14% of GDP, which is astronomically large. It's not unique. The American government's borrowing at roughly that scale, but of course they can borrow in their own currency, and we're not quite in that favourable position. Then what happened? How did this happen? Well, there has been a collapse of government revenue, basically. The share of tax in the British economy is now about 35%, which is as low as it's been since the days of Harold Macmillan. Essentially the tax base has disintegrated. Large chunks of it from the financial sector and from housing have gone, and they're not going to come back in a hurry. Whereas public spending, 48% of GDP, is continuing to rise, partly because the government's trying to support the economy through the public sector, partly because more people are unemployed, and they're having to be supported through job seekers allowance benefits of various kinds. So you've got this massive gap. 12, 13, 14% of GDP. We'll hear in the budget in 3 weeks' time what it really is. And that money is having to be borrowed. And it can be borrowed at the moment. There's not an enormous problem right now. Government can borrow at relatively low cost of capital. Yields on bonds are historically quite low, and there's no problem getting it away. But we all know that this can't continue, and there's growing worry about sovereign debt, and the government is going to have, whoever's in power after May, is going to have to come up with some pretty convincing plans about how all this is brought under control. And the exit strategy from this mess is very, very tricky, because if governments don't move quickly enough, or at least don't signal seriousness about dealing with the deficit, there will be a severe reaction amongst people who lend to this country. Cost of capital will go up. On the other hand, if the government cuts too soon, what will then happen is that this will deepen the recession in the short term. It will get through to the private sector because of public procurement, because of lack of spending by people who suddenly start panicking about the loss of jobs, and the economy will go down, and actually the deficit will get worse. So the timing issues here are absolutely crucial, and what's one of the reasons I've been arguing on behalf of my party, that we've really got to approach this in an economically rational way and balance on the one hand, evidence of recovery, such as it is, employment, growth, credit conditions, against the threats of difficulties of borrowing in international capital markets. It's got to be done economically rationally. It shouldn't be dealt with through political slogans, which is unfortunately what's happening. So these are some of the inhibiting factors for recovery, and they're quite serious. Lack of consumer confidence, the indebtedness of households, the problems with the banks, and the issues around the withdrawal of quantitative easing and the budget. And you can tell a pretty negative story around those things if you want to be gloomy.